All right, take your Bibles. You can go to Luke chapter 5. Again, we are going to also be in Hebrews chapter 12, but we're going to start there in chapter 5 where we were last week, where we've been for a while. And as you're turning there, let me ask you a question. Has anyone in here ever played the game Oregon Trail or the Oregon Trail? Well, okay. There's a few more than I thought last time I asked that question to somebody else, but it was a computer game that was designed by the Minnesota Educational Computer Consortium back in the 70s to teach students what it took to be a pioneer. In the game, it was set in the era of the Western expansion of the mid-1800s, and your character was a wagon leader who was headed out west to Oregon, or Oregon, however you want to say that. As the game starts, you make several decisions that will dictate how your expedition goes. You get to pick your character, whether he's a banker or a carpenter or a farmer, who your companions are, and what month or season you want to leave in. And each one of those had their pros and cons, and then you get to go to the general store and spend and split up the $400 you start with among bullets and ammo and guns and spare wagon parts, and of course oxen. Otherwise, you'd be pulling your own wagon across the plains. And as you would head out, the game was most famous for the ways that you could die whilst traveling out west. There were robbers, there were bandits, wild animals, rivers, and most infamously, dysentery. And if you've ever played the game or seen the memes or the shirts that people have made, it has the picture of the ox and the cart, and it says, "You have died of dysentery." And it was just kind of a joke that people from the 90s who grew up in the 90s probably understand. But the intro to the game went something like this. Thousands were looking west to build better lives for themselves and their families. People from all walks of life are selling all that they have and packing up the remaining items in small covered wagons. They're leaving friends and relatives behind and heading across the plains to Oregon. It's not an easy journey. It's full of challenges and dangers, disease, deserts, buffalo stampedes, steep hills, and treacherous rivers. But the last line says this: "Many do not succeed, but for those who do, the rewards are great adventure and opportunity." And in the mind of a pioneer, the risk is always there, but the rewards are always worth it. Last week, we looked at our journey with Jesus through the Gospel of Luke as a sort of road trip that we're going along the way with different characters coming in and out at different stops, and there are different issues that happen along this trip we're taking through that Gospel. And for me personally, one of the favorite things I like to do on a trip, if I have the time, is to stop off at some kind of roadside attraction or scenic view, or maybe even a museum or something like that kind of tells you about the history of a place. Sometimes it's a plaque, sometimes it's a building, sometimes it's just you staring across the vast wilderness of from the Blue Ridge Parkway or something like that. And you get to see and you get a good perspective that you don't get when you're down in the weeds. For the next 3 to 4 weeks, we're going to take a kind of side quest, starting with our text from last week in Luke 5. And we're going to discover some very real-life applications and a mindset that we need to grab a hold of if we're headed into this new church year, and we're going to do all that God has planned for us in 2027. So let's look here, first of all, in Luke chapter 5, and just keep in mind what we talked about last week as we read this. Chapter 5, verses 36 through 39. He spoke a parable to them, the Pharisees and the disciples of John, and even his own disciples, I would say. "No one puts a piece from a new garment on an old one. Otherwise, the new makes a tear, and also the pieces that was taken out of the new does not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the wineskins and be spilled, and the wineskins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And no one, having drunk old wine, immediately desires new, for he says, 'The old is better.'" The real problem our Pharisee friends are having here is they have a fear of the unknown and the unfamiliar. But it is not limited only to them. Almost everybody who encounters Jesus in his lifetime misunderstands his intent. And when it becomes obvious that the cross was his destination, even his own disciples will retreat and will run away back to the things they used to know. And you know of the story of Peter and James and John. And Peter says, I go a-fishing. And he goes back to the old way of doing things because that's what he's seen to be safe, and that's what he sees to be the thing he knows the best. But for the Pharisees in particular, which we spoke about last week, we know that Jesus has already fulfilled the burden of proof to them, so that they know who he is. We know that from the testimony of Nicodemus from John chapter 3, who was not just a Pharisee, but a leader, a ruler of the Pharisees. And he clearly says, we know that you are come from God, a teacher come from God, because no one can do what you do unless God is with him. So we know that they got it. We know that they know what Jesus knows, right? So they get it. But even though they know that, at every turn along this journey, they will gripe, they will moan, and they will complain. We have never done anything like this before. It was too new, it was too radical, it was too outside the box of their little religious parties and groups and clubs, so to speak, for them to grasp. For the crowds, his teachings are going to become too demanding. When he says you can't just divorce your wife or your husband for any reason, they're going to be like, whoa, wait a second. When he says you need to love your enemies, when he says you need to give and not ask again, he says you need to be radically generous, and he goes through all these things, which we'll look at in the next chapter of Luke when we get back to it in a few weeks. They are going to say, that's too much. And then for his own disciples, their thoughts of glory ended up being at the end of a road they were not willing at the time to travel. Everybody will see Jesus as this big idea that once they get to know him, they no longer want. And Jesus in this text, in the end of chapter 5, is warning them of his true intentions. He's essentially saying, I am not here to prop up and to protect the old way of doing things. I am here to lead you to a whole new frontier. Things are going to be different. They're going to be new. And your real problem is that you've become so comfortable with the old that you'll never set out to explore the new. No matter how much I prove to you that the new will be better. That's how that verse ends. That's why he says that. He says, you've been intoxicated on the old, so much so that when I show you what is new and is better, you will refuse it. And we know that's what happens. One by one, the warm blanket of status quo wrapped around the hearts of his audience to the point that they would rather see Jesus crucified than to leave behind the safety of what they already knew in their minds. So go to Hebrews chapter 2 with that in mind. Hebrews chapter 2, or Hebrews chapter 12, I mean. Hebrews is all about better. That is the key word of the letter of Hebrews, is the word better. Almost the entire first portion of this letter, this book, is written comparing the old with the new being Jesus. The Old Testament with Moses, with Joshua, with the angels, with all the things that the people that we've been studying had known all their lives. And in chapter 12 of Hebrews, we're going to get a glimpse into the end of the story and the destination that Luke eventually will take us to. So let's read Hebrews chapter 12 with everything I've said in mind already. And let's read verse 1 and 2. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, or tangles our feet, essentially. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Number one, we want to look at the safety of the status quo. This is the problem. This is the problem that Jesus deals with. This is the problem that God really deals with from the beginning of the Bible even to the end. We have the safety of the status quo. The epistle, as I said, of Hebrews is written to the same people that we've encountered already in our study of Luke. It's the same people, right? namely to the Jews, to the Hebrew people. That is who Jesus initially is speaking to almost all the way through. In fact, Jesus says his mission is specifically to speak to the people of the house of Israel, to Hebrews. So this writer is writing to the same people we've already met in our study of Luke up to chapter 5 so far. Except these guys are becoming or looking to become believers. Nobody knows who the human writer of Hebrews is, but it is obvious that his intent, that the Spirit's intent in having this letter written, was to call the people to radical abandonment of all they'd ever known and to embrace fully the truth of Jesus as their Messiah, regardless of the risk that was involved. That's the point of the book of Hebrews. And really the same point that Jesus made in Luke chapter 5, verses 36 through 39. Most of the beginning, as I said, of this letter has been comparing the old and new, and that Jesus is better, way better than everything in every way possible. But the problem was that these Hebrew believers, for them to leave behind the old religious system that was helped created by the Pharisees, who we met last week, the problem is that them to leave that behind was a practical death sentence for them. See, for us in 2026 America, it is easy and simple to say, I believe in Jesus, and to partake in baptism because it doesn't cost us anything. As long as you don't try to spread your faith, that's the one thing that you might get some flack for. But as long as you don't do that, you'll actually be held in high regard because people still enjoy people who are religious or spiritual. And that goes for whether you converted to Islam or to Buddhism or to Taoism or to any of the other isms that are out there today. People still appreciate a religious person as long as you keep it to yourself. But for these guys here, they are being asked not simply to come up in front of a church and be baptized and everybody clap, but they have to leave behind. It meant losing or leaving everything behind. Marriages would end. Jobs would be lost. Families would have literal funerals for them as though they had died, and you would never be able to be in contact with the people you used to know ever again. And by the time the writer pens Hebrews, many had lost their lives for no other reason but that they chose to follow Jesus as the Christ. So there was a high cost involved here. When the guy writes this letter, he's not talking about someone, bad-mouthing them on social media or maybe saying something, kind of a slight or being passive-aggressive towards them. He's talking to a people who literally must leave something behind and go forward, as he says in the next chapter, bearing the reproach of Christ, or the bad reputation he has among their own people. And so think about it this way. When you put your hand on a stove that is hot, what happens? It burns. What does your body say? Ouch, and hey, idiot, don't do that, right? And for the rest of your life, your brain says, do not put your hand on a hot stove because it's dangerous to you. And that's normal, general survival instinct. Don't do things that hurt. But the problem, and usually that's a good thing to do. But here, the fear and the threat is just as real, but the thing causing them pain and loss is the same thing that the writer is asking them to continue in. Right? Because their faith in Jesus is costing them everything. And they must leave behind them the old and launch out into the new, pursue Christ. So the writer is calling these Hebrews to leave safety behind and embrace the risk of following Jesus openly, not secretly. Like Nicodemus, his whole life from John 3 up until the end, he sits there and he hides what he knows is true. And you remember back at Easter, we talked about him, how he hid and he hid and he hid, and he wasn't consenting to the death of Jesus, but he didn't also do anything about it until Jesus is dead. Then finally he says, you know what? It's time for me to do something about it. And him and Joseph of Arimathea, they go to the tomb and they prepare the body and do all that stuff, but he's already dead. And they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't stand up in the time they should have stood up. It's thankful for him that they did it eventually, but that is what they are facing. To be put out of the synagogue is what it was called. And that was for us to be put out of the church, you can just drive down the road and go to the next church, right? I mean, it's not that difficult in America. There's like 50 there's 50 Baptist churches in Haywood County right now. If you don't like me, you don't like what's going on, you can just go get in your car, go down the corner and go up to the next one and see what you don't like there. But there, in this culture, when you are synagogued or put out, it wasn't just out of a building or a group, it was everybody. It was a race. It was everything you'd ever known. This is the issue. This is why the idea of status quo is so intoxicating, because it means that you can be safe. Number two, that's the problem, and this is what we're being called to, the risk of the unknown. The risk of the unknown, to push out into something that you aren't sure of, but you at least know that God is calling you to that. Verse 1. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. That word ensnares means like a net at the feet. It entangles the feet. Let's put the sin aside. But notice I want this last phrase. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Next week, we'll look into who this cloud of witnesses is and what he's referring to, but just know this, that the entire chapter of chapter 11 was spent giving us examples of other people in the Old Testament who had made the same choice and had taken the same risks, and we now know their stories at the end of the day. That they, as Hebrews says, the world wasn't even worthy of them being in it. Stories of God's goodness in the pain. Stories of victory, great victories over impossible odds. Stories that still echo through even the secular world today. David and Goliath. What is that? What does that mean? What world does that live in today? Where you hear it all the time. It's a David and Goliath matchup. Every sportscaster uses that. When there's some team who came out of nowhere and no one's ever thought about that they could win, and they go up against some other team that everybody's like, this ain't even going to happen. And they call it a what? A David and Goliath matchup. You know how that story even comes to pass? Because one day, some little shepherd dude showed up at the battlefield when everybody else was afraid to do anything and said, is there not a reason to fight? And he went out there and threw a stone at Goliath's head, dropped him on the ground. Then he stepped on him, took his own sword out, which was probably as big as he was, and cut his head off, right? That's the story we know today, because there was a small child, basically a teenager, who said, I'm not going to sit behind the walls of safety like everybody else does. I'm going to go out there and simply trust that when God said that one of you will chase 100, this is only one giant. So I can definitely do this. So he had faith, the risk of the unknown. And these stories, all of chapter 11, tells us the stories of these witnesses of God's goodness, even in problems. So the writer now begins to paint a picture of the arena where people are watching us compete in the same struggle that the Old Testament saints did, except, as we've talked about on Wednesday nights a bunch of times, they had not received the promise of the Holy Spirit. We have. So we have more than they do. You have much more than Elijah and Elisha and David and Solomon and Moses ever thought about having. You have more. If you have the Holy Spirit of God inside of you, they never got that. That's what all of chapter 11 describes for us. So he's trying to paint this picture now of these people who have been faithful without the promises we now possess. And we should be more than willing to go out into this unknown world and do the things that God's called us to do. Notice the end of verse 1. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. The word run here, the Greek word treko, means generally to run at speed or with maximum effort. In classical Greek writings, like in the tragedies of Homer and Herodotus, it had also taken on the meaning of fighting a decisive struggle, especially one involving danger, honor, or survival. And when he said running, what it meant was to fully engage, to risk everything, to put it all on the line. As they say in football, you left it all on the field. I did everything I could. I sweated, and I poured it out. And I got into the locker room at the end, and I was about to die. Why? Because I left it all out there. I gave it all on the field. And that's essentially what this word had come to mean. The word race here in the same verse, run the race, is the word agon, where we get our word what? Agony. It is the common Greek term for any athletic endeavor. And some of you in here probably understand that, right? Athletics to you is pure agony. And that's what it is. That's what, to participate in athletics, or really in any struggle, which this word came to mean, it is to agonize for something. You're pursuing something with all your energy focused in one direction, and you're pouring it out for the opportunity of standing on the podium and saying, I am the winner. That's the picture that this word has in it, to agonize for victory. And in fact, the Greek writer Euripides, I hope I said that right, he also uses almost the exact same phrasing as our writer right here. As he's talking about Heracles in his conversation with the chorus, Heracles is explaining that he's on the way to perform one of his labors, and if you know the story, he has 10 labors, I think, he has to do and accomplish. And this particular one he's on, he has to... I lost my whole place here. He has to go and to capture the man-eating horses of the Thracian king Diomedes. And when the chorus hears this, he warns him that this is an extremely dangerous thing to do. You will either have to kill Diomedes or he will kill you. Essentially, the chorus tells him there is no other option. It's either this or that. It's pass or fail. You must win or you will die. And what does he respond with? Almost the exact phrase. He says, this would not be the first race I have run. So the Greek idea of running a race means that I am willing to put everything on the line to see if I could be the victor. It doesn't guarantee victory, but it says that if I lose, I'm losing empty. That's what it means. And even in the Greek writers, they use the same phrase. It's almost exactly the same as the writer here uses it. Here's the point. What we are being called to do as Christians is not an easy task. If your Christian life has never cost you anything, it's never been inconvenient, that you've never had to put forth maximum effort, it's doubtful you're really living in the call of God for your life. Everybody's call costs them something, and you must put out effort to accomplish it. And everywhere, from the Old Testament into the New, one thing marks the life of a person pursuing God, and that is struggle and controversy and conflict with the world around them. So like these Hebrews believers, we are being called to something beyond our limits, beyond those safe walls of mediocrity and status quo. We are being called out to do something. And like the Pharisees of chapter 5 in Luke, who sat by in the best seats during the day that the paralyzed man is healed, it's easy to look the part, to sit in the pew, to give a few dollars, to halfway sing a song, and to stand up at the end and say, oh, that was a good day to go out. But when Jesus calls us out and demands real action like he did from them, commands true obedience to the risk of losing the safety of our status quo, we, like them, are often not really down for that kind of struggle. And that's unfortunate. Because victories, what have we been saying on Wednesday nights? Victories come after battles. That's the basic, bare bones axiom you must understand in your Christian walk. You can't stand on the winner's podium without running the race. You can't take the land without conquering the king. You can't win unless you run, unless you fight, unless you wrestle. There is always a struggle, and Jesus isn't calling us as a church to just sit down and do what we've always done any more than he was telling the Pharisees, y'all's religious thing, you can just keep doing that. He doesn't say that. He says, you know what? You're like, if I were to give you everything I got, would be like old wineskins with new wine, and your mind would be blown and explode. That's what he tells them. The same problem is being faced by these people here. They have come to know Christ. They're of the same ilk and same yoke as those people we read in chapter 5 of Luke, and they're having the same struggle. They know that Jesus is the Christ, but the conflict and the struggle is so difficult, and the writer is saying we must do more, and Jesus is calling our church to do more, just like them. There's more work to be done. There's more souls like Levi, who have such a corrupt and broken history, who need to know the truth of grace. There are people like the leper and the paralyzed man who need a touch from God. There are young men like Peter, James, and John who in the beginning of Luke chapter 5 need to be called up and called out to service and be discipled and be formed so that they can go out and do that. And who is going to do that but the church? But the fear is intoxicating. Safety, security, and status quo are the graveyard of many a legacy church because it's easy, as I said, to sit and to say it's somebody else's job. But to get into the fight, as Paul said, with the armor on, as Peter said, arm yourselves with the mind of Christ. To do that and to get into the fray, to head out into the unknown, to be like Heracles who knows he may not win his fight, but he's going to do it anyways. That is the kind of courage that we need to have. And lucky for us, we have a good example. Number 3, the example of our pioneer, or the pioneer. Look at chapter 12, verse 2. Jesus is not asking us to do something he did not do himself. Look at verse 2. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame or disregarding the shame, and is now set down at the right hand of the throne of God. I know sometimes these Greek word ideas can maybe get tedious, but there's a lot of little nuggets in the background that are hiding, and I need you to see something specific in this verse. Now, you can see the obvious exhortation that's here. Jesus left everything behind too. He left behind the safety that him being God afforded him. He didn't need to do what he did. Read Philippians chapter 2. He is God. He was equal with God. He did not need to come, and yet he chose to do so. And it's saying the same thing here. He left it all behind because he knew beyond the trials and the dangers of the wilderness, so to speak, lay a future where joy was abundant and we could be restored to him, right? The joy set before him is the accomplishing of his mission, which is us with him, in him, as we said, and also at the end in Revelation chapter 21, verse 3, where we will be with him ourselves personally. That's the joy at the end of his race, of his struggle. And he was willing to do that. It says he endured the cross, disregarded its shame, and now has victory, and he sits on the throne beside his Father, making intercession for us who are also going through our own struggle today here in this world. So we're not alone because he did it first. And that's the exhortation here. It's the pep talk. That's the pre-game speech that's supposed to get you ready to go out through the tunnel and break through that, whatever, that tape they would always have, and get on the field and to pour it out for the opportunity to say, I'm the champion. That's the mindset he wants us to have. To get out there, even if it's not sure. And I need you to understand, though, the first title that the writer gives Jesus in this verse. It may say author, it may say something else there, but the word there is archegos. Thayer defines this word like this in his commentary. One who takes the lead in anything and thus affords an example for us to follow. A predecessor in a matter. Or he puts this simply, he just puts one word, pioneer. He says the definition of this word is pioneer, the first one in. That's who Jesus is. He's the first one in. He's the first one to come into this world to live it properly. He's the first one who went into death and came back out again. He was the first one to take the keys of hell and death and say, you don't get to rule here anymore. He is the pioneer. He went into the wilderness of our sin and our problems and our issues, and he cut the way open. As Colossians says, he took out of the way all the things that were between us and fellowship with God, and he blazed the trail. He's not asking us to do something he himself did not do. He is our pioneer. He's our archegos. He's the first one in. He's the one who went before us. And so the New English translation puts it like this: keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set out for him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Now I want you to think back over everything we studied. When Jesus showed up, everyone was excited for him to be the Messiah, the Christ, the Savior. He's going to bring us the kingdom, and we're going to rule, and we're going to have all this good stuff. But when he started to tell them what it would take, when he started to tell them his actual mission, when he started to lay the cost before them, and he clearly defines it, no one can be my disciple unless he takes up his cross daily and follows after me. He laid it out. He's not someone looking for a crowd. He's not the evangelist who stands on the stage begging someone, 15 times as Just As I Am keeps playing in the background. He says, this is the cost. This is the prize. This is the kingdom. This is all the good stuff. Here's what it takes. And when he did that, everybody said, that's too much. It's too far. It's too much. They wanted to hide behind their walls of fortified religious and ethnic and social prejudices, and they wanted to hide in their safety, a status quo, while the wilderness was being opened up by Jesus to a whole new frontier. But they refused to follow because they had fear. They didn't want to do that. It's not something I've ever done before. For us, church, today, no invitation. It's very simple. And this will be the next couple weeks until our new year. Our future is beyond the walls of this building. What we are called to do is not simply just gather and assemble. That's part of it. But the whole reason, and it's in Hebrews itself, I think the next chapter, the whole reason we're supposed to gather and assemble like this is so that we can promote the actions we take out there. Everything that happens in here, everything in this building, me, you, these pews, the songbooks, the Bible, my tablet, my iPad, these windows, the AC, the light bulb, the hallways, the education building, every single thing exists for the mission, so that the mission can be accomplished. And the mission is not here. It's not to build this up and make it look clean and good and presentable. It's so that we can go out there and bring people to this place so that they also can be sent out as well. We have a mission. We have something that's for us to do. And every year is kind of a pass-fail. A year is either progress or it's regress. It's either success or it's failure. It's either victory or it's defeat. Generally, those things are mixed in there. You can't have a full year of just success. That wouldn't be normal. We know that there will be failures and issues and things that we don't do well, but we are always to be pursuing forward, and it will be what we make of it. The point is, for us at this point in time, for Mount Zion Baptist Church, there's no time for caution. We know that it's out there. There are kids who need people in their schools mentoring them. There are teenagers who need people in this building taking them aside and say, hey, let's go get coffee and let me help you through your Bible study and teach you how to do that. There are people who need us to be on mission constantly, to go out into the frontier of our county, into the wilderness where Jesus is calling us to, and to build outposts out there where we are helping travelers along the way. The whole symbol of our logo is the waymark. It's the arrow on a compass or on a map that says, go this way, not that way. That's the whole point we're here, to point the way to Jesus by proclaiming his word faithfully and doing the work he's called us to do. But it ain't easy. It's not comfortable, and it's not convenient. It costs us sometimes money, sometimes time. It's always effort in some form or fashion. But we must be pioneers. The Pharisees and Jews would miss the greatest opportunity of their lifetime, not because they didn't understand who Jesus was, but they didn't want to leave the safety and security of what they used to know and embrace the adventure of following Jesus. That's the bottom line. They knew who he was. They just didn't want to go out there. It's too hard. I don't want to touch a leper. I don't want to talk to people like Levi. I certainly don't want to talk to Gentiles, and you'll see that in the next couple chapters, that it's the Gentiles who show up with the most faith. And what Jesus is about to show them in the next couple chapters when we get back to it is going to wreck them because they don't want it. So we have a choice to make. We, like them, have long history of doing. What will we do next? What's the next quarter of this 21st century going to look like for us? Will we launch out into the unknown and accomplish great things for God, or at least attempt them? Or will we pull in and be satisfied with the status quo of sitting in a pew once in a while, and that's it?